Walk into any truck stop in America, look at the rigs parked in those lots. Freightliner, Western Star, the big Class 8 iron that keeps this country moving. Now ask the driver what engine is under the hood. 9 times out of 10, he'll say Detroit. And 9 times out of 10, he has no idea that Detroit Freightliner and Western Star are all owned by the exact same German corporation, Daimler Truck AG. You think you're choosing between competing brands? You're not. You're choosing between different labels on the same shelf. That's the con. And it took decades to set up. But before Daimler swallowed Detroit whole, there was a different story. One that started in a machine shop in 1938, ran hot through a world war, nearly burned out completely in the late 1970s, got resurrected by a racing legend, and then got sold to Stuttgart for $700 million. Detroit Diesel isn't just a brand, it's a mirror of what happened to American heavy industry. Brilliant, dominant, neglected, exploited, and eventually absorbed into something else entirely. Let's go back to the beginning. It was Charles Kettering who started this. The same man who invented the electric starter, developed leaded gasoline, and gave the world Freon. In 1930, General Motors acquired the Winton Engine Company in Cleveland, and Kettering put his research team to work on something new, a lighter, faster, more compact diesel. Not the slow, heavy brutes that powered ships, something that could go in a truck, something that could win a war. There were early test units. There were reliability problems. There was internal infighting at General Motors between Kettering's research lab and the Winton team, who did not even want to build two-stroke engines. General Motors did. General Motors won that argument. And what came out of it was the Series 71, a two-stroke diesel engine where the number literally referred to the cubic inch displacement per cylinder. 71 cubic inches per hole. It debuted in 1938. By 1941, General Motors' Detroit Diesel Division was building 9,000 of them a year. By 1944, that number was 62,000. Landing craft, tanks, generators, minesweepers. The two-stroke screamed to life wherever American military logistics needed reliable power. The signature sound, that high-pitched mechanical wail, became known on job sites and highways as the Screaming Jimmy. Truckers loved it. Fleet superintendents loved it more. By the early 1970s, Detroit Diesel held over 40% of the entire American diesel engine market. 40%. That's what dominance looks like. That's what invincibility feels like. Then Cummins threw a grenade. Cummins Engine Company released the 855 Big Cam, a 4-stroke diesel. Quieter, cleaner. It was the first heavy-duty engine to meet both the new federal noise and pollution standards of the era. The Series 71, designed in the 1930s, was suddenly exposed. Loud, smoky, fuel-hungry. It was structurally incapable of meeting tightening EPA regulations because the two-stroke architecture burned oil through its own scavenging process. The Roots blower that gave the 71 its signature whine was the same mechanism that made it structurally unable to clean itself up. You cannot detune a two-stroke to save fuel without strangling it. The engineering compromise was baked in from the beginning. Detroit's market share fell off a cliff, not gradually, off a cliff, from 40% to under 5% in less than a decade. The parent company, General Motors, watched it happen and did almost nothing. Of the $50 billion General Motors spent on plant modernization through the 1980s, $100 million went to Detroit Diesel, 0.2%. The division that had powered the American war machine received $100 million while General Motors was spending billions upgrading everything else. Bad engines started leaving the factory floor. Fleet customers switched to Cummins. The institutional knowledge started bleeding out. By 1987, revenues were $842 million, but the division had lost $600 million in the previous 5 years and held a 3.5% market share. A spokesman would later admit bluntly that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Detroit Diesel was letting bad product out the door. General Motors started looking for a buyer. Roger Penske was that buyer. Racing legend, business wunderkind. At the time, he owned the Detroit Diesel distributorship for New York and New Jersey. He knew exactly how damaged the brand was. He bought in anyway. $50 million for a 60% controlling stake, plus a $115 million loan from General Motors' own finance arm to fund the operation. On paper, it looked insane. In practice, Penske understood something the General Motors bureaucracy did not. The problem was not the product, it was the culture. Within weeks of taking over, Penske slashed the operating budget by more than $70 million. Jobs cut, facilities consolidated, redundant computer systems eliminated. The morale of the workforce was destroyed. People did not believe the company could survive. So Roger Penske invited all 3,000 Detroit diesel employees to the Michigan International Speedway for a race. Not a town hall meeting, not a company newsletter, a race. He showed them speed. He showed them what winning looked like, and then he put them back to work on what would become the most important diesel engine in American history. The Series 60 had actually been under secret development inside General Motors engineering labs since the early 1980s. And here is a fact that almost nobody outside the industry knows. The core engineering work on the Series 60 was largely done by borrowed John Deere engineers. General Motors knew its internal diesel talent had atrophied, so it went outside. John Deere engineers brought four-stroke architecture expertise, clean sheet design thinking, and fresh eyes to an engine program that General Motors' own team could not rescue alone. The engine that would save Detroit diesel was developed with farm equipment expertise hidden inside a General Motors facility. That is how desperate things were. The Series 60 debuted in 1987, an inline six-cylinder, four-stroke, overhead camshaft. It was available in 11.1 and 12.7 liters. It later expanded to 14 liters with 575 horsepower and 1,850 pound-feet of torque at the flywheel. But the displacement was not the revolution. The revolution was the Detroit Diesel Electronic Control System, known as DDEC. The Series 60 was the first heavy-duty diesel engine in history with fully integrated electronic controls. Every competitor on the market, Cummins and Caterpillar, were still running mechanical fuel injection. Fixed timing, fixed metering. The driver set the throttle, and the mechanical governor did the rest. Crude, effective, but ultimately limited. The DDEC used a microprocessor-controlled electronic unit injection system with solenoid-operated injectors on every cylinder. The engine control module could read dozens of sensors simultaneously: turbocharger boost pressure, fuel pressure, coolant temperature, and adjust injection timing and fuel metering on the fly, thousands of times per minute. The engine could recalibrate itself in real time based on load, altitude, temperature, and throttle demand. Cummins N14 drivers loved their engine's throttle response. Caterpillar 3406E owners swore by its durability. But fleet managers, the people paying the fuel bills, ran the numbers and ordered Detroit's. The DDEC's precision injection controlled not just power but waste, less unburned fuel, better thermal efficiency, and the DDEC kept records. Every overspeed event, every hard brake, every hour of unnecessary idle time. Fleet operators could pull a history of the engine's life and discipline drivers based on hard data. That was revolutionary in the late 1980s. Nobody else offered it. There was even a trick built into the software called cruise power. During normal highway operation, the 12.7-liter Series 60 made 430 horsepower. Engage the cruise control, and the engine control module unlocked an additional 40 horsepower, making 470 horsepower at cruise because the engine operated at its most efficient load point in steady-state highway driving. The computer rewarded the driver for using cruise control. That is not engineering. That is behavioral manipulation baked into silicon. The Series 60 prescribed initial overhaul intervals of 500,000 miles, then raised that to 750,000 miles once field reliability data came in. By 1993, Penske had clawed market share back to 33%. Detroit was alive again. Then came 1998, October 22nd, 1998. The Department of Justice and the EPA announced what was at that moment the largest civil penalty in environmental law history. $83.4 million against 7 diesel manufacturers with a combined settlement obligation exceeding $1 billion. Detroit Diesel was on the list. So were Cummins, Caterpillar, Mack, Navistar, Volvo, and Renault. All 7 had sold heavy-duty engines equipped with illegal defeat devices. The same DDEC technology, which was sold to fleets as an efficiency tool, had been programmed to recognize when the engine was running the EPA 20-minute federal test procedure and to behave differently during that test than on the highway. On the test, clean. On the road, nitrogen oxide emissions running at up to 3 times the legal limit. 1.3 million affected engines. On the highway right now in 1998, emitting more than 1.3 million tons of excess nitrogen oxides that year alone. Detroit tried to fight the consent decree modifications all the way into 2002. A federal court said no. Case name: United States versus Detroit Diesel Corporation. The name of the case says everything. 2 years later, Daimler Chrysler bought what remained of the independent Detroit Diesel for $723 million, including assumed debt. The brand that Roger Penske had dragged back from a 3.5% market share got folded into a German truck conglomerate. The diesel was dropped from the name in 2011. The Series 60, the engine that saved the company, was discontinued that same year. In 2024, a supply chain dispute between DDC and a Mexican transmission housing supplier named Martin Rea Hansel nearly shut down the Redford, Michigan plant entirely. Federal Judge Jonathan J.C. Gray had to issue a preliminary injunction to keep the parts moving. Freightliner and Western Star together accounted for 40.8% of every new Class 8 truck sold in America that year. Half the new trucks on American highways depend on a supply chain that one Mexican factory can hold hostage. That's the legacy. The engine that built the American highway system is now a subsidiary of Stuttgart, kept alive by court orders, selling into a market it no longer controls, through dealers who can't work on it without proprietary software from the same German parent company. Detroit didn't lose. It was bought, renamed, and converted into a revenue stream. There's a difference. Most people just don't notice it when they're filling out their fuel logs.